People went out, had a blood test, spent money, and waited for the results to come back in to see a 45% resolution, which, absent any other data, may sound kind of good. Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, let's discuss the elemental diet. This is one of the most effective therapies that we use in the clinic, and thankfully it's so easy to use and it's natural. So if you're struggling with a wide array of digestive symptoms, and we'll cover research regarding IBS, SIBO, inflammatory bowel disease, a condition known as EOE, which is this inflammatory allergic condition, and even joints, rheumatoid arthritis, all being documented to be able to safely be remedied with the use of this very simple, again, safe and natural tool known as the elemental diet. And one of the ways I like to think about the elemental diet is akin to if you sprained your ankle. If you did sprain your ankle, logic would suggest that with time off of the ankle, it would heal. Whereas if you were running, let's say 3 miles per day, it would be very hard for your ankle to heal. And months and maybe even years later, you'd still be complaining, oh, my ankle, it's swollen, it's irritated. And maybe you'd have imaging, and that imaging would show that there's inflammation, and you say, oh my goodness, I'm never going to be able to heal my leaky ankle, leaky gut analogy. But with rest, it could easily heal. And some of you may have noticed that if you don't eat, you feel better. Well, this is kind of where the elemental diet comes in. So let's go over again what the elemental diet is, the research, show me the evidence of how it can help you, and then some easy ways to use it, because you may have heard or read about a very strict method through which to utilize the elemental diet. And thankfully, some research shows us we don't have to be this fastidious. Okay, so what is the elemental diet? It's essentially a complete meal replacement. Think of like a protein shake or a meal replacement shake that's designed to be very gut friendly. It's hypoallergenic. It's pre-digested. It's low or no fiber or prebiotics. So, akin to the analogy of taking time off of a sprained ankle, the elemental diet essentially allows your intestinal tract not to have to work to digest all of the food stuff, because the food stuff is pre-digested, therefore easily absorbed, therefore allows your intestines a chance to rest. Also, it's hypoallergenic, meaning the ingredients are designed to not trigger an inflammatory response. Now, I should also mention that some elemental diets do contain whey protein. Dairy, well, whey protein is actually very well tolerated, and as we'll demonstrate in some of the research, works very well to reduce inflammation in the GI tract. So we want to be careful not to lump all dairy in with whey, especially if it's a high quality casein and lactose free whey protein. But again, said simply, because this formula absorbs within the first few feet, 2 or 3 feet of the 30-ish feet of the small intestine, it gives the majority of the intestinal tract a chance to rest. It doesn't trigger allergy or inflammation because it's hypoallergenic, and it can starve, as I'll show you in a moment, things like SIBO, and I also believe it can starve things like fungus. Unless it's thrush, then maybe not so much. However, generally speaking, very, very effective therapy. But show me the evidence. You have likely heard, and if not, I'm happy to share this with you, of this seminal paper by Mark Pimentel that did find a 80% normalization rate in a SIBO breath test when using the elemental diet, and also a 65% improvement in IBS symptoms. Now, here's also where some of the problems come from, meaning this trial used the elemental diet strictly for 14 days. This means participants did nothing but elemental diet, liquid diet, meal replacement shakes for 2 weeks. And thankfully, and I'll share the data with you in a moment, you don't have to do this to reap the benefits. This is one study. This study can then inform other methods of utilizing the diet, but we don't have to be, as I say, strictly evidence-based, we can be evidence-guided. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I first wanted to share with you another study that was recently published or at least recently came across my radar, and it helps tie together two important principles. In this meta-analysis of 13 studies, they found the lowest degree of resolution of an inflammatory condition in the intestinal tract known as EOE was 45% when using a food allergy guided diet, meaning people went out, had a blood test, spent money, and waited for the results to come back in to see a 45% resolution, which, absent any other data, may sound kind of good. But as you can see from the schematic, and I'll narrate for you also, if participants were put on either a 4-food or a 6-food elimination diet, meaning, hey, from decades of research, we know 4 foods that are often problematic. We know another 2 foods on top of those 4, so 6 foods that are often problematic. No cost, no waiting for lab results, just given a dietary handout, you see 53% resolution of this inflammatory condition, eliminating 4 foods, and you see a 72% elimination of this inflammatory syndrome known as EOE when cutting out 6 foods. So the one concept to tie in here kind of in parallel is that a simple evidence-guided diet handout led to better resolution than spending hundreds or maybe $1,000 on a food allergy test. And better yet still, when participants used a elemental diet, they saw a 90% resolution rate in this eosinophilic esophagitis, which is an atopic disorder of the esophagus where people eat and they feel like something is stuck in their throat. And this does correlate with IBS and with IBD, but it's just a great study to show you that testing did not lead to a high degree of resolution. A template diet of cutting out 4 foods or 6 foods, and as you can see, the foods here include eggs, wheat, soy, milk, nuts, and shellfish. Sounds kind of like a paleo diet and/or an autoimmune paleo diet template. And the best results were when using an elemental diet. So all of this to drive home 2 points. 1, elemental diets are effective, and 2, at least in the model of EOE, which correlates with IBS and IBD, more effective than spending money on a food allergy test. But let's come back to the fact that these elemental diets, these hypoallergenic meal replacement shakes, can be used in a relaxed application. We don't have to do the rigid 14 days strict exclusive as the Pimentel-SIBO IBS study found. This randomized control trial in patients with Crohn's, they were allocated to either continue on their medication mesalazine in one group and do nothing else, or the other group continue on their IBD medication mesalazine, plus also replace about half of their calories per day with an elemental diet. So it was relaxed. You can replace about half of your calories. As we say in the clinic, we call it the hybrid approach, meaning replace 1 or 2 meals per day with an elemental diet. And this study is one of the main data points that has driven our clinical recommendation. And what you see after a year follow-up, so people did this for a year, they had 1 or 2 shakes. Most people, I shouldn't say most people, some people are doing a shake, let's say in the morning because it's quick and easy, and then maybe 1 more after a workout. So this is not something that has to be kind of shoehorned in your lifestyle. It tends to fit in fairly easily for a number of individuals. And what did you know? After 1 year, the relapse rate of inflammatory bowel disease was cut in half when using the elemental diet to replace roughly 2 meals per day. So this is one of the main data points that has helped us to see we can use the elemental in a more relaxed fashion. And why this matters is if you've heard of the elemental diet and said, oh boy, I like the fact that it's natural. You know, my GI doctor wants me to do rifaximin, but I don't want to use an antibiotic, but I'm not sure what else to do. Again, always check these things with your doctor or with your healthcare provider, but this gives us evidence that shows, well, maybe I can use the elemental diet. Maybe I don't have to say, well, it's either rifaximin or it's 2 weeks strict rigid. we can use these in a hybrid or a relaxed or a half and half application, and it seems to work well, in this case, very well for inflammatory bowel disease. And certainly there's a huge body of anecdotal data where patients with IBS, with SIBO, also benefit from, again, this relaxed use of the elemental diet. Now, when we discuss any intervention that is lower fiber, lower prebiotic, as is the elemental diet, what can come up is, well, isn't this not good because it doesn't feed the intestinal bacteria? Now, it depends. Firstly, let's put up on the screen a systematic review that did find the elemental diet temporarily reduces the richness or the diversity of the gut microbiota. Is this bad? Well, if you've been paying attention to what we've been discussing on the podcast now for years and years, I've been trying to point out to you this concept that the large intestinal impact on health is something, but it's minimal as compared to the small intestine. Well, what's my evidence? Well, let's break this down. Gut microbiota stool tests assess the large intestine. They do not assess the small intestine. Well, why does this matter? Because the large intestine is 5 feet in length. The small intestine is 22 feet in length. The large intestine is responsible for minimal caloric and nutrient absorption. The small intestine absorbs 95% of nutrients and calories. Also, the small intestine is where leaky gut occurs. It has the greatest density of immune cells, immune receptors, and gut receptors. And final point here, the large intestine contains the majority of the microbiota. The small intestine contains relatively few bacteria. However, look at this, and this is a quote from the journal Gut. It is important to note that we can live without a colon, large intestine, but not without a small intestine. So hopefully this helps you see where my perspective comes from in that, yes, assessing the microbiota, mainly the large intestine, via a stool test and looking at diversity is an important part of research. However, the more important part of your intestinal tract is the small intestine, again, because it's longer, it absorbs most of your nutrients, it's where most immune function occurs, although it's not a rich reservoir of bacteria. So we shouldn't be making decisions only centered around what happens to the tip of the iceberg, the large intestine, and we should be looking more globally at what can we do to facilitate health in the small intestine, which, oh, by the way, happens to correlate with less SIBO, less IBS, less IBD, less EOE, and as we'll cover in a moment here, even less rheumatoid arthritis. And that is this next study looking at prednisone, an anti-inflammatory steroid, compared to the elemental diet, and they found equivalent effectiveness for reducing this autoimmune and inflammatory condition in the joints, RA, when using elemental dieting as compared to prednisone. Now, what specifically are the ingredients? Well, you have a protein, a carbohydrate, and a fat source. And these ingredients are all pre-digested. Now, the pre-digested part can get a little bit murky in terms of how much pre-digestion is necessary. Probably the most important aspect of this is a reduction in the level of fiber and of prebiotics. These are what tend to be the most triggering, hence the fact that a low FODMAP diet is probably the most effective diet for IBS. So we have carbs as maltodextrin or as glucose. And I know, oh my goodness, maltodextrin and glucose, aren't sugars bad? Well, it depends. If you're trying to just feed bacteria to favor the large intestine, then you want a lot of fiber and prebiotics. But if you're someone who has noticed you have sensitive digestion, you've probably noticed a lot of raw vegetables, a lot of vegetables in general can trigger you. And this is because we have to look at what happens in the small intestine. So these easy to absorb sugars can help give that sprained ankle a chance to rest. So this is actually where something like maltodextrin has merit. And also a protein source coming from either free amino acids or a whey protein. Now, the whey protein can be partially hydrolyzed, meaning partially digested. And I want to loop in here another remark that I think will help some of you who are well-read and can sometimes have enough information to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, so to speak. Now, when I first learned, maybe 7 years ago, of the elemental diet, I was very much of the persuasion it's got to be fully elemental. Meaning, if we think of a spectrum from non-digested all the way down through fully digested would mean fully elemental. But there's a spectrum, and this meta-analysis of 27 randomized control trials found that it didn't matter if the elemental diet was fully elemental or partially elemental, it had the same degree of effectiveness. Why this matters? When using fully digested amino acids as a protein source, it's more expensive and the flavor is not as good. However, if we can use partially hydrolyzed whey protein or even whey protein, both of these are very easy to digest, hypoallergenic, and it doesn't seem to make a difference in terms of the effectiveness, but it will lower the cost and improve the flavor profile. So I just wanted to make sure to loop that in because every once in a while someone says, well, shouldn't I use the fully elemental? And again, I don't think so. I would recommend starting with the whey version and seeing how that sits with you, and then only consider the fully elemental if you notice that the whey protein does not sit well with you. But again, for most people, it actually seems to be quite effective. It's less expensive and it has a better flavor profile. Again, check this with your doctor, but I see so many people who are just afraid of whey because I think whey is like ice cream, right? Meaning like all dairy is lumped in together, and whey protein is great for body composition. It also seems to be very easy to absorb and digest and doesn't seem to trigger people's IBS, IBD, or other digestive symptoms. So I just want to make sure to loop that in. So elemental diets, natural, safe, effective, and easy to use. You do not have to use them for 14 days exclusively. Thankfully, you also don't need a fully elemental diet because, as we've outlined, the partially hydrolyzed whey or even just regular whey seem to be very well tolerated by most. And again, this will bring down the cost and improve the flavor profile. So if you're struggling with IBS, IBD, EOE, RA, maybe some undiagnosed condition wherein you're just having these GI symptoms, gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, reflux, indigestion, and you're not sure exactly why, consider an elemental diet, check in with your healthcare provider. But thankfully, again, this is a very inexpensive, safe, and natural therapeutic that can be quite effective in allowing your gut a chance to rest. And like that sprained ankle from earlier, if it can rest, it can usually heal. All right, guys, hopefully this helps. I'll talk to you next time.